topical with this. We're sticking primarily with Luke, but we are picking up some of the pieces that Luke doesn't record out of some of the other Gospels. So here's a review of what we talked about last night, kind of an overview of these trials. So first there was the religious Jewish trial, and we said that there were 3 stages to this. The first stage was when he appeared before Annas, and this particular incident, only John records this. And this would be like what we would think of as the indictment stage of the trial. The goal was to establish religious charges against Jesus. The outcome was that there was a lack of organization because of the rushed nature of the event. And so there were no witnesses and there was no verdict. You may recall that the Jews were wanting to wait until after the Passover to take care of Jesus, but Jesus, being in control of the situation and being the Passover lamb, was determined that his sacrifice would be on the Passover. So that escalated their timetable, and we see some of the disarray that's a result of that. So no witnesses and no verdict in that first stage. The second stage of the Jewish religious trial is when he is before Caiaphas and Sanhedrin. And we see that, a brief mention of that in Luke and the other Gospels, and Matthew has the most complete retelling of that. So we're going to spend some time in Matthew tonight to take a look at that. And during the second stage, the goal was to prove that Jesus had shown disrespect for the temple, and thereby they could establish charges of blasphemy. The result was, well, as we'll see tonight, the result was that the witnesses that were presented didn't agree with one another, and again, there was no verdict. Well, then the third phase of this religious trial, and we'll also talk about this tonight, was the condemnation. And we'll go back to Luke for this. Luke gives the most complete coverage of this. So during this condemnation phase, the goal was to give some sense of legitimacy or legality to the proceedings. Remember, so far, these proceedings have been taking place at night, which was against their laws. So the outcome of this stage is an official condemnation for blasphemy. They declared a guilty verdict, and Jesus was sentenced to death, and we'll go into more detail about that. But in the Roman Empire, the Sanhedrin didn't have the authority to execute a person. They couldn't carry out capital punishment. So they have to go back to the Roman authorities to rely on that. And then the second part that we'll cover next week is the civil Roman trial. It also had 3 stages to it. And the first stage was when Jesus appears before Pilate, and all of the Gospels record this particular stage, and we'll go to Luke to see that. The goal of this stage was to establish a case that would be punishable by death in the eyes of Rome. So now it's change in focus from the Jewish law and tradition onto the Roman law. So they're going to try Jesus for sedition. And the outcome was Pilate declares him to be innocent. Then the second stage is where Jesus appears before Herod Antipas, and Luke is the only gospel writer that records this piece, so we'll go back to Luke to cover this. And here the goal was to establish a charge of sedition against Rome. Well, Jesus was from Galilee. Pilate knew this, and he also knew that Herod was in town. And Herod was the guy who was in charge of Galilee, so Pilate says, okay, we're going to ship him off to Herod. So they send Jesus off to Herod, who held the jurisdiction over Galilee. And the outcome of this part of the trial was a declaration of innocence. And then the final piece was this third stage of the civil Roman trial, which again we'll cover next week, was Jesus goes back to Pilate again. And this is in all the Gospels, and we'll again focus on Luke. So Jesus was to be set free at that point. So the Sanhedrin had the goal of charging Jesus with blasphemy. Again, the outcome was a declaration of innocence, but Jesus was sentenced to death because Pilate caved in to the crowds and the influence of the Pharisees. So that's kind of the overview of the trials. Just a little bit of a reminder of where we're at on the map. We think that this is approximately the path that Jesus followed from Gethsemane up there in the top right. We don't know exactly Obviously, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, so some of these places we're kind of guessing at. Some we're pretty sure of, others are a little suspect. But it appears that he kind of followed numerically here from 1 to 2 to 3, and then eventually ending up at Golgotha. And some of this path is also more popularly known as the Via Dolorosa. So when you do that, and Catholics observe the Stations of the Cross, that's along that path as well. Well, then we talked about some of the portions of the law that were violated during Jesus' trial. And again, I have this on the back of your handout, so you don't have to try to scribble this down, but it's right there. And you may want to refer to that throughout the night, because we'll see that that a lot of these come into play this evening. And this list was put together by Dr. Fruchtenbaum. He listed 22 violations of the law that were made at this trial. And so I will put them up here briefly for the benefit of those who are on Zoom or who are viewing the recording later on. You can reference them and see them. And then there's the second page, and we'll notice a lot of these that are going to come up tonight regarding witnesses, and forcing the accused to testify against himself was illegal. A person couldn't be condemned on the basis of his own words. So we're going to see all these things come up. And then the last few, again, about sentence being pronounced after a waiting period. You couldn't beat or scourge somebody who's been punished to death, or who's been sentenced to death. That was one of the regulations. And again, that obviously was not held up. So anyway, all of these laws were broken in Jesus' trial. Well, then finally last week we focused on Peter, and we saw that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus had predicted. From the gospel records here, we're putting them together. It appears that denial began kind of during the trial of Annas, and then it carried over into the second phase of Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. And that's when the third denial came. Luke's the only gospel writer that tells us that Jesus looked Peter right in the eye after that third denial and after the cock crowed, and certainly crushed Peter. Okay, so that's kind of a quick recap of where we've been. So tonight we're going to talk more about the second stage of that religious Jewish trial. And this happens before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. So let's take a look at that account in Matthew. So if you'll turn to Matthew 26, I'll go ahead and read that. Beginning in verse 57. Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. And Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards to see the end. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last, 2 came forward and said, "This man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." And the high priest stood up and said, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you, O Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Okay, so we see first off here in this passage that Jesus led to Caiaphas. Some of the other Gospels just mention this very briefly. They talk about how Jesus was taken to Caiaphas, and that's really all they say about this particular appearance before Caiaphas. But Matthew goes into a lot more detail. And so this wording about being led to Caiaphas reminds us of a prophecy from Isaiah. Somebody has Isaiah 53, verse 7.
He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like the sheep that before its shears is silent, so he opened not his mouth.
So Jesus being led to Caiaphas reminds us and is a fulfillment of these words of Isaiah centuries before. Jesus went willingly. We saw a picture last week that yes, there were cords around his wrist, but they were not holding him. He's in control here, and he's going willingly. Peter also spoke of these events later when he wrote in his letter. Somebody has 1 Peter 2, 21 to 23.
Committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he reviled, he did not revile in return. He suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself who judges justly.
Well, Peter was an eyewitness to these goings on, so he certainly speaks with authority as he writes those words about Jesus' innocence and Jesus being led away. Now, as kind of a side note here, as we read through this retelling here, a lot of commentators have pointed out that maybe we're getting this inside information from somebody who was a member of the Sanhedrin, who maybe was secretly sympathetic to Jesus, or maybe, as we read in the book of Acts, there were a number of priests that came to the faith. Maybe that's where we get the information. Well, in any event, the details are pretty. There's a lot of detail here, so we assume that it's coming from an insider. Now, isn't it interesting to note here that the Sanhedrin has already been assembled in the middle of the night at the house of Caiaphas? They're all there waiting when Jesus arrives. So clearly, this has all been arranged beforehand. They've orchestrated this evil. This is a show trial. It's not a legitimate proceeding. Now, there's no record that any member of the Sanhedrin protested that a trial was scheduled in the middle of the night, which, again, on your list is one of the things that was against their laws. They had been put on alert, and they arrived promptly before Jesus showed up. So we assume there was at least a quorum. We talked about this last week. The Sanhedrin was made up of 71 members, and they had to have at least 23 members there to be a quorum and to conduct any proceedings. So we assume there were that many there. Maybe all 71 were there, but they've been breaking so many rules along the way, we really don't know how many were present. So we can only just make some guesses about that. It seems likely that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who were a part of the Sanhedrin, were not there. I mean, later we read that Joseph was not in agreement with the decision. And from what we've read about Nicodemus before, we would assume that he probably wasn't there. Well, then we see in verse 59 that the chief priests are out there soliciting witnesses. And again, on your list, that's one thing that the judges are not to do. They're not to go out and solicit witnesses. And it says that many false witnesses came forward, but they were unable to substantiate any charge warranting death. So all of this scheming on the part of the Sanhedrin has just led to an impasse. Well, then finally, there were a couple of witnesses that came forward, and this tells us that the Sanhedrin's been trying to look for some time to find these two witnesses. Finally, they get them together, and they kind of sort of agree. They tell a story that's kind of similar, but it really doesn't hold up to a test. And the reason they want to find these two witnesses is because they're trying to meet the requirements of the law. So that's in Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. We'll just read that one verse.
A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of two witnesses or three witnesses shall a charge be established.
We're going to come back to the next verses here in just a minute, but this is what they have in their mind when they're looking for 2 or 3 witnesses. And here again, the Sanhedrin members are supposed to be judges, but at this point, they're not acting as judges. They're out looking for witnesses. They're actually prosecuting the case against Jesus. So finally, these 2 witnesses come forward, and they make somewhat similar statements. But their testimony doesn't pass the test that the Jews had for consistency. And this test of consistency was demanded of witnesses. The Gospels actually give us these 2 slightly different testimonies. The one we read here in Matthew tells us in verse 61 that a witness testified that he heard Jesus say, "I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days." Mark gives us a little different detail. Mark gives us some more detail about this. Mark 14, 58 and 59.
We heard him say, "I will destroy the temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." But not even them did their testimony agree.
So Mark makes it clear that the testimony of these 2 guys didn't agree, and you'll notice the difference, right? In Matthew, he says, "I am able to destroy the temple." Mark says, "I will destroy it and rebuild it." So there's a difference there. One is expressing intent, and the other is just saying that he's able to do it. So again, there's not agreement there. This would not pass the test of consistency that the Jews would typically have in these cases. So there's one other thing, and that is what these 2 guys have testified to. In neither case is it what Jesus actually said. What he said was something different than that. And we have his actual words recorded in John chapter 2, 19 through 22. Somebody has that.
Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It is taking 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
When Jesus said destroy this temple, he didn't say that he was going to destroy the temple. He was saying that the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the Jews, were going to destroy him. We're going to destroy his temple. And then he would raise it up again. So he's prophesying to his resurrection that was coming just a few days away. And he didn't mean he was going to rebuild the physical temple while he could have, but he was prophesying about his resurrection. So it's interesting to note that the same accusation was leveled against Stephen. And we read this a couple Sundays ago in our Acts study on Sunday. Somebody has Acts 6, 13 and 14. Let's refresh our memories on that.
They put forward false witnesses who said, "This man incessantly speaks against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses has handed down to us."
So the Jews are continuing to drum up this charge about somebody destroying the temple, about what Jesus said, even though that wasn't what he said. So even months later, in the case of Stephen, they're still bringing these charges up. Doing something bad to their temple was the greatest offense they could imagine. And of course, the temple actually would be destroyed, but not by Jesus, but by the Romans in 70 AD. Well, not only do we have these witnesses, a lot of false witnesses, and these 2 in particular whose stories conflict, but under the law, these false witnesses are to receive a punishment. And now we'll go back to Deuteronomy to pick that up. Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 to 20.
If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord. before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently. And if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. And the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil against you. Your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
Important that there are at least 2 or 3 witnesses at a trial. Important that they agree that their stories are in line. But if they are false witnesses, they're telling truth, then there's a severe penalty. They incur whatever penalty the accused would have incurred. But obviously these witnesses are feeling safe because they've been pushed into this, and they know that there's not going to be any charges of false testimony against them because it's the priests who've encouraged them to lie. So not only don't these 2 witnesses agree with one another about Jesus' words, but they both misrepresent his actual words, and they try to twist something Jesus said to use it against him. Well, at this point, Caiaphas stands up and asks Jesus what he has to say in response. Caiaphas recognizes he's got a problem on his hands. He's got a problem with these witnesses. It's clear to him and everyone else gathered that their testimony is inadequate. It's in conflict. So Caiaphas has got to do something else about the situation. He has to use another tactic. So he's going to ask Jesus for a response to the false testimony that was given. And again, I think if you look on your list, you'll see on your list that that was breaking one of the laws. You can't try to coerce an accused to testify against himself, but that's precisely what Caiaphas does here. He's trying to goad Jesus to incriminate himself. And I think that's number 10 on your list there that talks about that. So since these so-called witnesses have failed to produce the desired result, Caiaphas tries to elicit some condemning words from Jesus' own lips. Well, as we look in verse 63, we see Jesus remains silent. And this is, again, is fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. We see this in Psalm 38. Somebody has Psalm 38, 12 through 15.
Those who seek my life lay their snares. Those who seek my hurt speak of ruin and meditate treachery all day long. But I am like a deaf man, I do not hear, like a mute man who does not open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear, and whose mouth are no rebukes. But for you, O Lord, do I wait. It is you, O Lord, my God, who will answer.
Jesus is putting his hope in God, not the outcome of a Jewish trial. He could have put on a brilliant defense at this point. He could have called any number of character witnesses to come in. He could have brought forth those whom he had healed or fed. He could have called for Lazarus to testify of his power over death. But really, at this point, there was nothing that Jesus could have said that would have changed their minds. The witnesses don't agree, so no charge has been substantiated. The burden of proof is not on him, but on his accusers, and in this case, the Sanhedrin itself. So he's not obliged to say anything under their law, and so he remains silent. Well, let's think about a couple of application questions here. So, as you think about how Jesus is reacting here to this, what would you say about this? How do you respond when you're wrongly accused? Do you get defensive or try to justify yourself or lash back? Or for me, it's all of the above sometimes.
Depends
Depends, yeah.
on who's doing the accusing and what the accusation is. You know, I handle it differently from my wife than I would some dude on the street. Wife has different rules. Can I get an amen?
Yeah, amen. Yeah.
I think it's based on the purpose and like the impact. If it's like something really trivial, I would simply not care. But if it's something that I fully believe that it's monumental in like consequence or principle or anything, I would try probably fight as hard to like either get my name off or just like let them know that they're totally wrong.
I think in today's climate, it's a slippery slope, not to really think about how you react. I can recall like how it slowly changed in like the workplace, where bad actors would try to blame somebody else for something, and they would react and make themselves look bad, when in actuality that person was baiting them. And it's become very prevalent, this virtue signaling, and so it's a really loaded question. It's real difficult now, especially now with where virtue signaling is so strong.
So I think Jesus had the benefit of knowing what's in people's hearts. So if he knows already that they're dead set on this, accusing him, it's pointless. I know it's fulfillment of scripture, but also I figured he knows the hearts of the Sanhedrin. He knows this. There's nothing that's going to persuade them. There's not one heart in there that's not against him in every trial. So in a way, what would be the point if he knows that? But since we don't know the heart of the people that are accusing us, there are times when I think you want to clear your conscience, and you don't know if maybe they had a misunderstanding, and so you don't say it in a mean way. You say with gentleness and respect, like 1 Peter 3:15 talks about, because I don't know their heart, and maybe they just need to be told what actually happened, and they're operating off a misunderstanding. Maybe say, "Oh, I had no idea. I'm so sorry that I falsely accused you." On the other hand, there's probably so many times where saying nothing is just like the best thing that you could do too. Almost in a way, you can't go wrong. And at least in the interpersonal context, if someone's accusing you of murder and you didn't do it, you probably want to say something. You probably want to say something with your lawyer there.
Yeah.
Maybe not like just you in a room with someone else, but you want your lawyer there. But you probably want to defend yourself there. I'm sure, but just in the normal. My first thought to that question is like, the problem with thinking how to respond when I'm wrongly accused is that everybody's always right when they accuse me of something. So, it's like, man, you're right. I don't know why I did that. I'm sorry. So, what does that feel, me being wrongly accused? I'm always guilty of it.
And we see here that Jesus is silent, but as we go through the trial, he isn't always silent. He does speak up. It's not like he's just, like that's always the answer, right? Is to just take it in. There are times when he sets the record straight.
Also, the thing about it, if you look at through the ministry of Jesus, and it plainly says that he didn't say things a certain way because it wasn't his time yet. Throughout all of this, Jesus knows that this is leading to the purpose of him being here in the first place, right? So he doesn't say anything. He could, as you mentioned, provide all sorts of defense. He could even create a hologram or something. He could do whatever he wanted. But why is he going to give a defense? This is necessary. And I've always looked at this. Maybe it's just my mind. So don't take this as gospel or creedal. I've always looked at this as like, here's Caiaphas. Okay, so everybody's woke up in the middle of the night, so everybody's a little groggy and not exactly in the best of mood. They bring it in there, they get as many as they can get in there, and they found some witnesses, so they got them sitting in the back, and now it's time for the witnesses to come, and the witnesses are just, it doesn't say what they say, but they're just falling all down. And you just see Caiaphas kind of going, and so finally a couple of them kind of sound, and that was probably the story, I'm sure that story, because Jesus said it so early, that was the story kind of going along. He said something about the temple and he could raise it up. That was part of the thing. So finally they just got a couple of guys that heard it or heard a story. Okay, it's close enough. And so Caiaphas is going finally,
I think that's a good portrayal here. I think Caiaphas is just like, he's smacking his head. What's going on here? I thought we had this under control.
The chosen make sure they do it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Then Jesus just kind of says, okay, let me help this thing along. And
Yeah.
he's out the Son of Man thing.
Yeah, yeah.
We gotta move this thing along, all right?
Exactly. Okay, well, let's move along then. Again, the purpose of this portion of the trial is to establish charges of disrespect toward the temple. Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum says there was one exception to the Roman law that prevented the Jews from putting someone to death, and that exception that the Romans allowed was for one who showed disrespect to the temple. So if the Sanhedrin had been able to prove that, then they would have ended the matter by executing Jesus themselves, which created another set of problems. So their disagreeing false witnesses leave the charges unproven. So if this had been a fair trial, a normal trial, it would be over at this point. But the Sanhedrin had determined that Jesus was guilty before the trial ever started. So now the search for a crime must continue. So we see here that Caiaphas' next words, we need to see them for what they are. He's desperate and enraged, as Eric was saying. Everything he's tried so far has failed. So when these witnesses are not in agreement, and Jesus has not taken the bait to incriminate himself. So then we see in verse 63, yeah. Verse 63, after Jesus remains silent, then it says that Pilate adjures Jesus. Now, sometimes in English, we use this word a little bit differently. We may get the wrong impression that the word is what the word means here. So when we use the word adjure, we mean to implore somebody or beseech or kind of beg. There's kind of this pleading aspect to it. But the Greek word that's used here is the word exarchizo. I've got an extra I in that I see up on the slide, but it's only one I, exarchizo. And this word means to cause someone to swear or to put someone under oath. Interestingly, it's also where we get our English word exorcist or exorcism. So Caiaphas isn't begging Jesus for his cooperation. He's trying to forcefully extract testimony from Jesus. He's putting Jesus under oath in the name of the living God to say whether or not he is the Christ, the Son of God. Now, Caiaphas clearly knew that Jesus had laid claim to both of these titles previously. And this is so ironic. Again, there's so much irony throughout this, but this is, again, ironic because while he wants Jesus to testify to the living God, it's the living God who is standing there before Caiaphas. Caiaphas is addressing the creator and sustainer of the universe. Jesus made clear on a number of occasions who he was. John records this. Somebody has John 10, 30 and 31 and 36 to 38.
The Father and I are one. Once again, the Jewish leaders picked up stones to kill him. Why do you call it blasphemy when the Holy One who was sent into the world by the Father says, I am the Son of God? Don't believe me unless I carry out my Father's work. But if I do his work, believe in what I have done, even if you don't believe me. Then you will realize that the Father is in me, and I am in the Father.
Jesus had made it clear through his words, but also through the many signs and miracles that he performed, that he indeed was the Son of God, that he was the Christ. Well, a person placed under oath in a Jewish trial was required to respond. So Jesus replies in verse 64, "You have said so." Mark records a more succinct response. And when Mark records this, he has Jesus saying, "I am." So Jesus' answer is simple and direct. He confirms the truth about himself to Caiaphas. Jesus goes on then to give a prophecy to all who are present. He says, "They will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power." And when they say power, that's the way the Jews would refer to God. They would say the word power, and that meant God. So they're going to see, Jesus says he's going to be seated at the right hand of power. And they would do that, they would say power instead of, that was one way of getting around having to say the name of God, because that was something they didn't want to do. So Jesus said he would be coming in the clouds of heaven. So here, the Messiah's second coming is announced to the religious leaders. Well, then in verses 65 to 67, we see a series of actions that, again, they're going to be on that list on the back of your page. They violate these laws of the Jewish trials. We see that Caiaphas tears his robe, which was forbidden. He then originates the charge of blasphemy, and the judges were not supposed to initiate charges, only investigate them. Then he asked, "What further need do we have of witnesses?" Well, that's real convenient, since all of his witnesses are worthless and discredited. And then he asked for Jesus to be condemned based on Jesus' own words, which again was not allowed. Well, the rest of the Sanhedrin is agreeing with this rant that Caiaphas is on when he said that Jesus was worthy of death. They agree with that. So they issue the proclamation without taking a vote. Right? There's no polling or no voting of the judges there. They just all agree. The proclamation was made at nighttime and without the required waiting period. And then they begin to spit on Jesus and hit him and taunt him. And their law had specified fines, and there were very strict fines for slapping someone, for hitting someone with a fist, for spitting on someone. I think spitting on someone, it required almost a year's wages of an average worker. So they were really strong penalties for this. But of course, there were no fines issued that night. So the goal of this second stage of the trial was to prove Jesus' disrespect toward the temple and establish a charge of blasphemy. The outcome was the witnesses' testimony didn't agree, and there was no verdict reached. So here's one artist's depiction of Christ before the Sanhedrin. This was painted by the Italian painter Loretto in the late 1400s. He came from Asti, Italy, which is in northwest Italy near Turin in Piedmont. And you can see the soldiers there and somebody raising his hand to strike Jesus and Caiaphas. There's a guy over there on the right. I'm pretty sure that in Judea in the first century they didn't wear maroon tights, but you know, when you're painting in Italy in the 15th century, you paint what you know, and so
The Jewish house wouldn't look so Roman either.
might not have looked quite so Roman, yeah. But there are a lot of good things in the painting that we can glean from it. We see the stress that Jesus is under, the look on his face. Again, we see the cords that are binding him, and they don't really look that heavy. Again, giving us the idea that Jesus could break away, and that he's not there because of the cords. He's there willingly to be the sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice, and the payment for the sins of mankind.
Is that tassel like a snake, or is it like all the way down?
I think that's the cord.
The cord? Oh, is it? I think it's like kind of.
Yeah, that's the cord coming down from his hands,
Oh,
yeah.
right, because I'm beating around.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
Is
interesting.
that a cat down there?
Looks like a cat. Yep,
I'll put his cat in between.
yeah. Okay. Well, then we come to the third phase and the final phase of this religious Jewish trial, and that's the condemnation. Matthew and Mark just make a very brief mention of this stage, so here we're going to go back to Luke and pick up Luke's account in it. So let's go to Luke chapter 22, and we'll read this together there. So Luke 22, begin in verse 66. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. And they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." So they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." So Luke begins with some important information here. He tells us that morning has arrived. And remember, it's been a big deal here that these trials are taking place at night. Now it's morning, and so apparently some of the Sanhedrin members have been shaken a little bit and realized maybe this isn't really quite legitimate what we've been doing, because it's all been taking place at night. So maybe we can kind of put a little lipstick on this pig and fix this. So they want to put this veneer of legitimacy over these proceedings that have been conducted at night. So they're going to hold another meeting in the daytime so that they can try to do that. They're trying to provide some sense of legality, and that's the goal of this third stage. The phrase there, "when day came," reminds us of the psalm that proclaims, "This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." And while that's a wonderful praise, while we have this upbeat song that's written that includes that as the lyrics, if we look at the context, it's really interesting. Somebody has Psalm 118, 22 to 24. We'll read the context of that phrase.
The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is a day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it.
So that joyous day that the psalm is talking about is the day the stone was rejected. It's the day of Jesus' blood being spilled on Calvary. It is this Passover day that we're reading about here in this chapter. And it truly is a day for rejoicing.
It's a very different context when you hear it.
It's different than how we think of it, isn't it? Yeah, we quote that verse all the time, and
It's
we're...
taken out of context when you hear it. So.
Yeah. We try to apply it to, this day today where we're living, and that we should be joyous today. And that's fine. The Lord does make every day, but it's specifically talking about this day here. Well, another thing that we see here is that, again, in this attempt to bring some legitimacy to this mock trial, they're going to move Jesus to the council. Remember, we said that one of the other things that was happening here was that these trials were to take place in their council chambers. And up to this point, they've been taking place at either Annas' house or at Caiaphas' house in a private residence, and not in the council chambers. So now they're going to move to this official council chamber that's within the temple complex, which is where the trial was to be conducted. And, okay, I think I have a slide out of order here, so bear with me a second. Yeah, okay. So here is the one depiction of what that looked like, where the Sanhedrin would meet. The room was called the Chamber of Hewn Stone. And then you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there's a drawing of what the temple looked like. So we see the Holy of Holies, then out to the priest's courtyard, then the women's courtyard. And that Chamber of Hewn Stone is that little red area there, just kind of off of the priest's courtyard. So that's where this room would have been. And so that was their official meeting place. That's where the trials were to be held, was there. So now they finally moved to this council room. So again, now it's the right time, it's in the daytime, and now they're in the right place. So they're going to try to repair the damage that's happened here. Okay. Okay, so there we go. So now as they come together here, they're going to confront Jesus about being the Messiah. So in our English translation, when they begin talking, they say if. We might better understand that as the word since. So since you are the Messiah. Verse 67 might read more like, since you are the Christ or the Messiah, tell us or admit it. And again, this is very similar to the question they asked before at nighttime that Caiaphas had put to Jesus. So basically the same question. And Jesus answers him and says, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. So Jesus could make this statement because he'd been telling them for 3 years that he was the Messiah. He had demonstrated it with signs and wonders and miracles. And he had just told them a few hours ago in the middle of the night when they asked him. They didn't believe. He also asked them questions previously that they would not answer. And so that's why he makes this reference here that if I asked you, would not answer. We're reminded of this in Luke 20. Somebody has Luke 20, verses 3 through 8.
Jesus answered and said to them, I will also ask you a question, and you tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? They reasoned among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why did you believe him? But if we say from men, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet. So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, nor will I tell you what authority I do these things.
So Jesus had asked them a question before and they refused to answer. There are a couple of other occasions where he did the same thing, and so he reiterates that here. If we look in verse 69, we see that there's a change that Jesus is indicating. There's a change coming. And that's with this phrase, from now on. So soon, he says, they're going to see him no more because he's going to be seated at the right hand of God. We saw this earlier when we took a look at Jesus referring to Psalm 110, verse 1. Somebody can refresh us with Psalm 110, verse 1.
To my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.
So there was a prophecy there that Jesus would be seated at the Father's right hand in heaven, awaiting the time when God was going to bring his enemies at his feet. By the way, spoiler alert, in a few weeks on Sunday morning in Acts, we're going to see that Stephen is actually going to see this scene that Jesus is describing here. Stephen's going to look into heaven, and God's going to open his eyes, and he's going to testify to Pharisees he's standing before that he sees the heavens open, and he sees Jesus at the right hand of God. So that's coming shortly. Stay tuned. So the next time that these Jewish leaders are going to see Jesus is at his second coming, when he comes again in the clouds. We read about this in Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14.
As my vision continued that night, I saw someone who looked like a man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient One and was led into his presence. He was given authority, honor, and royal power over all the nations in the world, so that people of every race and nation and language would obey him. His rule is eternal. It will never end. His kingdom will never be destroyed.
So this prophecy of Daniel Jesus is talking about it again here, that there's going to be a time when he comes again in the clouds. Well, in verse 70, we see that the council speaks with one voice. They're united here in what they say. They ask Jesus if he is the Son of God. They're asking if he is equal with God. Well, as with the previous question, this has been asked and answered already by Jesus on a number of occasions. He said to them directly before, I and the Father are one. Here Jesus answered, you say that I am. This is really an idiomatic expression. It's like saying, we would say yes, or you said it. In fact, the New American Standard Translation puts it very directly. They translate Jesus' words here as saying, yes, I am. Very clear representation. So for all those who say that Jesus never claimed to be God, here it is. Well, the council responds similarly to when they heard Jesus a few hours ago say the same thing. Again, they conveniently say, well, we don't need any witnesses. Good thing, because they didn't have any that would agree. They've heard the accused's own words, and they're going to accept that as satisfactory evidence. The goal of this stage of the religious trial was to provide some sense of legality or legitimacy to the trial and to prove the charge of blasphemy. The outcome was that there was an official condemnation for blasphemy. The charge of blasphemy had to be based on the accused uttering the four-letter name of God, what we would sometimes say as Yahweh, that YHWH, that covenant name that God gave to Moses. That was the basis for blasphemy. Well, Jesus didn't say that, but they've accused him of blasphemy anyway. That didn't stop them from issuing this guilty verdict. Jesus was sentenced to death, but since the Sanhedrin has no authority to execute a man, they've got to take the case to the Roman authorities. Well, here again, Jesus is still in control of what's happening. If they had executed him, they would have done it by stoning. But the prophets foretold long ago that the Messiah is going to hang on a tree. He'll be crucified. So the evil plans of these unrighteous men are not going to thwart the sovereign will of God. So let's do a couple of application questions as we wrap up here. What does this passage teach us about God?
He's got a plan and it's going to come to fruition.
God is justice and righteousness and all these things, and here he is just suffering the worst kind of injustice and inequity and no person should ever have to deal with that, even here on earth, like be falsely accused or stand before a kangaroo court like this, let alone God. I mean, God is the one who's going to judge all things. So one side of it, God, you shouldn't have to put up with this kind of stuff. But then the other side of it is like just the audacity of people to put God on trial as if we get to accuse him of things. It's not like it only happens here. I mean, every day people are, you put God on trial, you accuse him, he didn't treat you right, and we act like he's the one that's got to give the defense for himself. But it's just the height of like sinful arrogance when we do that, not just if we do that. Just when we do that, it's just so ridiculous. And yet it's almost casually, we'll just take an umbrage at something and, God, why would you do that? He's got a right to start questioning anything he does, even if it seems unjust. I gotta be the one wrong, right? Not him. But it's such a crazy thing, like a crazy like court drama. If you like court dramas, and you love seeing like a lawyer just give some stellar defense and break down a witness, or someone that's been lying seems to get away with it, and they finally break down and confess to the whole deal. I love those kinds of things, but this is like it doesn't happen. He's got to be crucified.
I think inversely to what Pastor Drew is saying is that he sets an example of like, you think you get it bad? Like we all have these stories of why myself included, like why I found faith, and that example is so extraordinary. Like we all think that we have this. You'll never know the iniquity that was, I can't even talk about it, but you know, it's just this such humility and just so much grace that comes out of that. You know, and I can't help but think like, oh yeah, like what's that statement like? Oh, and you think you have problems? Like, so, just the example he sets.
More about, it tells us more about man and how desperate he is, and how evil and yucky we are.
Well, we've touched on this one a little bit already, but what does Jesus' silence in the face of accusations teach us about his character?
He was trusting. He was trusting you that it would come out the way that Father knew that it would be. You know, the Father and I are one.
He was entrusting himself to the Father, yeah.
And
He said for the Father to take this cup away from him, and he didn't, so he had to be obedient.
Okay, any closing thoughts? If not,
It just shows you how unbelievably pathetic and all people are, you know, the whole thing when you look at it. Just that we're all in need of what was going to happen, you know, so. Without that, where would we be?
all right, well, let me pray and we'll close our night.